Okay, so the New Deal is usually talked about in second part, so we're going to talk about the second New Deal today. How did Roosevelt respond to criticism from the left and the right that I mentioned in the previous lecture? So Roosevelt was a remarkable politician, and one thing that we don't get to talk about enough is the election of 1932, which I mentioned briefly. Yes, it was a landslide victory, and that's important to understand that. Um, and you may think that that was just anger at Hoover. Maybe that was just because he was so poorly responding to the Great Depression and not giving people what they needed. But it also reflects FDR, because in the election of 1932, there were several realignments. Um, for example, African Americans started voting for FDR, which was the first time they had voted Democrat in large um, groups. They had voted Republican because it was the party of Lincoln, basically since the Civil War. And Franklin Roosevelt really changed that. He had a coalition where he got together lots of people who wouldn't normally work together and was able to form kind of an unstoppable political party around that. Um, he was the master of the art of compromise. He knew when to push and when to pull back. Although he was a wealthy patrician, he had a sense of the people's needs. Um, we talked about earlier in the semester, the term, we talked about friendly visitors. They came off very judgmental and not very friendly and not really welcomed. Um, FDR, it didn't do that. And part of that was his wife, Eleanor. She definitely helped his image. Um, but he really seemed to understand, whether it was through her or through himself, the people's needs, and came across very sympathetic, even though um, he was wealthy and had never really suffered in this kind of way. Some historians believe that getting polio and learning to live with it sensitized him to other people's plights. Even though he's not often pictured during his presidency as handicapped, um, he was in a wheelchair most of the time. Um, he's our only four-term president. The FDR Monument in Washington, D.C. is a remarkable outdoor monument with four spaces for the four administrations. So he moved the program in 1935 towards the goals of social reform and social justice. The Work Progress Administration, the WPA, was the first massive attempt to deal with unemployment and its demoralizing effect on millions of Americans. 85% of funds went directly to salaries and wages. It employed about 3 million people a year in socially useful projects, eventually provided jobs to 8 million Americans, built bridges, airports, libraries, roads, 6,000 schools, 2,500 hospitals, and 13,000 playgrounds. It funded writers, musicians, artists. Only one person per family was eligible, so the jobs typically went to the husbands. Some women were head of the households and hired for sewing projects. The criticism, it claimed communists were hired to paint murals. Anytime we talk about social welfare or social justice, especially during this period, there's going to be a concern about socialism and communism. Um, Another thing I just want to point out about the WPA, I said they funded writers and musicians and artists, and one of the projects that they did was writers went back and collected the stories of former slaves that had never been written down. Um, and they talked about their slave life, and this can actually be found on the Library of Congress website. They're a really great primary resource. The National Youth Administration supplemented the WPA. It assisted women and men 16 to 25. Young Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson. So yes, young Nixon actually worked for the Youth Administration in California, and Lyndon Johnson in Texas was a state administrator. Um, The Resettlement Administration assisted farmers, relocated tenant farmers. 42% who lived on farms were tenant farmers. There was a fear of Soviet-style collective farming, so it had limited impact. The Rural Electrification Administration, REA, lent money, to cooperatives to generate and distribute electricity in isolated areas. Only 10% of U.S. farms had electricity in 1936. It changed lives, just like the TVA did. Lights instead of kerosene lamps, running water to run electric pumps, bathrooms for bathing, laundry, canning, and food preparation. So it really changed the way farmers were living. The National Labor Relations Act outlawed blacklisting, reasserted labor's right to organize and bargain collectively. The federal government became a regulator, a neutral arbitrator. Support increased for membership in unions, but the unions themselves still discriminated against women and minorities. Most unions did not allow women and often were solely white. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established the minimum wage of 25 cents an hour, raised to 40 cents 7 years later. 44-hour work week reduced to 40 3 years later. 16 years of age is a limit for children working in products involving interstate commerce. Affected non-unionized unprotected workers most, women, minors, and minorities. Okay, so the Social Security Act of 1935 is going to clearly be a large part of my lecture, as I'm sure most of you are aware, with the continuing impact. It's the most enduring reform. Social workers and reformers had long sought an old age pension, a national health insurance, and unemployment insurance. By the 1930s, the U.S. was the only major industrial country without such programs. Demographic, economic, and political pressures from federal actions was overwhelming. The percentage of aging population was increasing at twice the rate of general population. FDR convened a committee on economic security that supplied a set of recommendations to avoid destitution. It reflected a public commitment to the economic rights of people, recommended security for old people and children, employment, health, educational, and rehabilitative services. The compromise more conservative than the Committee on Economic Security's recommendations. The changes were just not as far-reaching as they originally recommended. It dropped national health insurance because of the opposition from the medical profession. It retained old age, 65, and survivor insurance. Employers and employees each pay 1% of the tax. Established a cooperative federal-state system of unemployment compensation. Included grants to states to care for the blind and the disabled. Some aid to dependent children, later aid to families with dependent children. There's a lot of issues with discrimination. It did not include farmers and domestic workers. Discriminated, and that's really important because women, and especially African American women, were more likely to work in domestic industries than they were to work in factories. So they were less likely to be able to access Social Security. It discriminated against married women, wage earners, no compensation for being homemakers, which was the most prized possession for women at the time. It relied on special benefits and penalized interrupted work, which women encountered more often than men because they stayed home with the children. Compensated inadequately for pay discrimination. Opposition was similar to the opposition that you'll see today for the Affordable Care Act. People thought it was too radical. It violated American concepts of self-help and individual responsibility. It was a threat to individual liberty and the American way of life. The other opposition said did not go far enough. As I mentioned, it didn't actually address all the issues that the Economic Security Committee thought that it should address. It did not provide for a logical plan for real Social Security, provided only enough support to avoid strong opposition. Some opposition tempered by recognition that it would allow older people to retire so younger ones could assume some of that employment. And it reflected marketplace principles and would help stabilize the economy. So earlier this week, I talked about people living paycheck to paycheck and not having savings. And this is part of what that means. So as people became aged and less able or less likely to work, they really had to keep working because there was no other way to pay for themselves. And relying on your family for support, especially during the Great Depression, was not always practical. So their hope was, and the theory was, that this would allow older people to retire, which would open up the jobs so that young, especially men, could work and support their families as heads of their households. It reflected market principles and would help stabilize the economy. It's a major realignment. It marked the beginning of a policy of federal aid to the states upon a permanent basis for regular, reoccurring social work, shattered the belief that anyone who wanted a job and was willing to work could get work. It closed the door on centuries of poor law and its principle of local responsibility. Because you'll remember that when we discussed poor law in week 1, we discussed this idea that it was very local and that you had to be a resident of the local area. And this is a federal program, and that's really huge in the way it changes the look at social welfare. It acknowledged that private agencies could not take care of the poor, and public agencies were a necessity to help the poor. It accepted that the federal budget would subsequently include funds for designated groups, still untouchable and inviolable act. So, New Deal limitations. Federal work relief programs were aimed at patching up rather than changing the system. Programs were designed to put all unemployed to work, to offer wages that competed with private businesses. At its peak, the New Deal employment at about 1/3 of the jobless, hours and wages fewer and lower than in the private sector. It was designed to not threaten profit in the private sector. FDR actually not interested in direct federal assistance. He preferred work relief. And like I said, that's because he was a conservative who really was concerned, again, about what would happen if you just gave people money that they wouldn't want to work. That they, again, this is a concern about laziness. And we can still see some of those arguments today. Depression obscured distinction of worthy and unworthy poor, but the New Deal actually revived that division. Federal support was for selected worthy groups, the elderly, the blind, and dependent children, and local aid was able to identify unworthy. Persisted in the distinction, the aid for the elderly and the blind, later to include disabled, was more generous than the aid to dependent children that was actually considered welfare. Fascinating research and theories on why the U.S. lags behind the industrial world in creating a welfare state. World War II was what finally actually brought full employment and ended the Great Depression. Okay, so this is my reference slide. This is a really important lecture on the Second New Deal and America's move into becoming a welfare state. So be sure, if you're going to look at workers' rights or unions or any of those kind of social welfare issues, they're going to be listed in this lecture. Thanks, guys. Have a great week.